first shift that we're going to make is, instead of taking the story from Shemot, we're going to back up and go to the end of Bereshit, because the story actually begins, well, you can go all the way back to creation, but the story actually begins towards the end of Bereshit, which explains how the Hebrews got to Egypt in the first place and what happened when Joseph was viceroy under Pharaoh. That's the first shift. The second shift, which correlates with the first, is to take the story from the perspective of the Egyptians. That becomes easier when we move the beginning of the story from Shemot into Bereshit. So we're going to shift perspective, and we're going to shift the starting point. And those are the two main shifts that Dina Weiss is talking about in her video. If you do have a chance to take a listen to it. Any questions on those shifts before we jump into that? Okay, then one more question before I bring up the text itself. Do you have sympathy for the Egyptians? Anybody? We know the story. This is our core story. Are you sympathetic? Can you take on the mantle of being an Egyptian and see this story from their perspective? Yeah, Marilyn.
I would have to imagine there's a lot of fear involved on their part. These things are happening. They're not in control. And yeah, they're trying to exist as well. And there's a lot of other junk going on in the world. So I could take that perspective.
Okay, interesting, good. Is there anyone else want to jump in? Okay. Yeah, Donna.
Well, first of
Hello.
all, when people are starving, it's easy to take their perspective, and people do all kinds of things when they're hungry. And yes, it's a matter of survival. Yes. And Pharaoh was the ultimate power, and the Jews had aligned themselves with Pharaoh.
Okay. All right. All right, let's take a look at the text. And what we're going to do is move back into Bereshit. So let me move this out of the way. Okay. You see how it's Bereshit 47? Not if you can see the text. We're good? Okay, here we go. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had instructed. You remember his brothers came down for food because there was a famine in Canaan, right? And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. Now, there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, that the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands." Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on that allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you. Sow the land. And at the harvest, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your household, and as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful, and multiplied exceedingly. Okay, well, so let's start with a question. Was there anything in what I just read from Bereshit that you didn't already know, or that you hear differently this time, in a new way this time? Yeah, Pat.
This is totally new. I've never heard that. And to go back to your original question, yeah, now I can have empathy for the Egyptians because they were being treated, they were being traded for slavery. They were giving up their freedom for food, which I can understand, because if you have a family to feed and you're hungry, you can't function very well. So it really was very surprising and a well-hidden story.
What's fascinating is that it's hidden in plain view.
Yeah, you never read that part.
Fascinating, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It doesn't exactly comport with the particular lens and point of view that we typically take on the story.
Right.
But when we open that lens and we have a larger aperture and we see the broader context, now it begins to inform the story differently.
Right. How long did that period go on?
Well, there's I can give you 2 answers, and both of them are somewhat, I don't know how factual either one of them is. Let's put it that way. But that Pharaoh had dreams, and he had the 7 and the 7, and Joseph interpreted them, and 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So now they're in the 7 years of famine. And it seems as though they're, midway, 2/3 through the 7 years of famine. And over that time, they become dispossessed of everything that they have, including their freedom, in order to survive those 7 years. Okay. So that's one answer to how long did this last? Let's assume that after the 7 years, things returned to normal. There was rain in its time. The Nile was flooding its banks appropriately. The other thing, though, is that it's going to be potentially 400 years before, or it's going to be many years before a Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph. And that enslavement lasts as long as 230 years, as long as 400 years. There's different numbers for that, and that's a question. But we have to get past this point where Joseph's renown has dissipated enough for there to even possibly be a Pharaoh who arose who didn't know his own history and didn't know Joseph. Good. Anybody else? Okay, so some questions for you. I think that everybody can now see that from this vantage point, when we shift the beginning point of the story, you see how the Egyptians might have been negatively disposed towards the Hebrews from way back. That there was not necessarily a predisposition to be angry at them and to feel violent towards them, but that when the opportunity presents itself for them to take on the role of slave holder, oppressor, there was an underlying resentment that was there to be tapped. Does that make sense? And we could perhaps say, well, but the Egyptians didn't really have to sell everything. I mean, they sold their bodies. Why would they sell their bodies? But I'm going to pick back upon what Donna said earlier, which is when you're hungry, I mean, if your survival is at stake, even freedom, what is your freedom if you are going to die? So then we feel less antagonistic towards them. We feel more empathetic towards them, more sympathetic towards them. Make sense? Okay, let's take the story another step forward. And actually, I should have asked, I love Dina's second question here. At the end of this story, at the part that we just read, it is the Egyptians who are slaves to Pharaoh. As an Egyptian, how do you feel about Pharaoh? Not how do you feel about Joseph and his family, but how do you feel about Pharaoh? That's such a good question. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and give us a chance to think about that. So by the end of this passage, they have no money, they have no land, they have no freedom. Everything has gone into Pharaoh's coffers. How do you feel towards Pharaoh?
I think with all royalty, there is an element of jealousy on the part of some of the populace. So I can't imagine they didn't feel a little bit difficult towards the Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He didn't share the food. He took their food.
Right. Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
I find that I would be sort of more upset with Pharaoh than with Joseph because I'm one of Pharaoh's people. Like if I'm an Egyptian, why isn't he taking care of me first? And Joseph isn't one of my people, so it's not his responsibility to take care of me. But why is Pharaoh treating me this way? I think that's how I would feel.
Yeah, Nancy. I mean, so if anything, your animosity would be aimed more directly. Pharaoh's the bullseye. And
correct.
And Joseph is somewhere on a concentric circle outside the bullseye. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nancy.
Well, one could look at it that the Egyptians they believed Pharaoh was God, the supreme God. Okay, so somehow, maybe they believed that this famine was caused by others or themselves. And so they knew Joseph was a human. So if you're going to take aim at someone, it isn't your God who is everything. You take aim at the human who gives the orders. And you can't do much against a God or the God. So your animosity, your hatred, your feeling of helplessness is towards the human who is giving out all these directives, because Pharaoh, like all despots, never gives the direct order. They just say, fix it. And, Joseph was the fixer.
Joseph, AKA Michael.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, and playing with that a little bit, taking it another step, because I like what you're saying here. So what Elizabeth said leads us in one direction, aiming, as Egyptians towards the target, identifying the target. Nancy's suggesting a different way of looking at that. If you hit that bullseye, if Pharaoh is your target and you hit that bullseye, you have now angered the God who is in charge of you. Are you sure that's the direction you want to go in? Because the relative power you have against this God is infinitesimal. Don't even be joking. And if Joseph is such a good stand-in for Pharaoh and doing the directives as he's instructed to do, then of course he's the one that you would target. No harm, no foul targeting Joseph. He's an other, he's an alien. So we could play it out that way and see the Egyptian point of view from that perspective. Fascinating. That's so cool. Anybody else? All right, so I'm going to share again. Here we go. Number 3, I'm going to just raise the question, but I have a feeling we can. While the Egyptians are losing their land in Egypt, Joseph's brothers appear to be unimpacted. How does that make you feel about Joseph's family? Right. So if it isn't bad enough how you feel about Joseph, his family seems to be cruising along. That can't be helpful in terms of the sympathy the Egyptians would have towards Joseph and his family. Let's take one more passage. This is coming, there we go. Actually, yeah, okay, here we go, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. There we go. Let me get, gee whiz. Get this up here and this down there. And where is it? There we go. There we go. Okay. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Joseph, with Jacob, each with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Okay, you see what she's done. Now she's in the beginning of, the very beginning of Shemot. We've left Breshit. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob, it was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us outsmart them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and depart from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. Verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Such a famous line. And Dina asks, question 1. The text in verse 8 highlights that a new king arose in Egypt. Why do you think it matters that there is a new king who doesn't know Joseph? How does that impact or enable his cruel policies? I'm going to open up with that question, but also sort of a standard question. Was there anything in that passage which you hadn't known or hear differently this time that you hear it read? And what difference would it make that there's a new Pharaoh? Judy.
There's sorry, I'm getting over some some stuff.
Not at all. It's so good to have you.
Thank you. There's this really strange dissonance about how, the Egyptians had to, sell themselves, and the Israelites are living just fine. But if there's something so jarring about that scenario, that, why are they living the life in this kind of oasis, and the rest of Egypt isn't doing well? So that's the first thing that felt a little jarring with this text. And then, this notion of, Joseph was kind of our protexia. And, if generations later, we don't know from that, there's no protexia. You're a lot more vulnerable.
Yes. Yes. It's good. Bill, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
After reading this, I could see why the Egyptians kind of felt threatened with the Jews, because they were so numerous, and it's almost like an argument in America today that the Jews will not replace us, and that whole Christian nationalism kind of thing, that there are people in our land that don't belong here. It's kind of that same argument that there's aliens among us or something. It just seems that it's a continuum.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that there are tropes in the way that the world perceives Jews that are very, very deeply embedded, sort of in the human psyche. I don't know where they exactly came from or why they seem to play out every so often, but we're in the midst of a rise in some of those nasty tropes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I also think that Judy's point about, and then I'll get you, Donna, Judy's point about the addendum at the end of the passage before that, that Joseph and his family did not suffer want. Everyone else, all the Egyptians, are selling every single thing they have, including their freedom, to survive. But the Hebrews in the land of Goshen seem to be fine. And so let's assume that when Joseph was sort of enacting his plan of storing grain during the 7 good years in order to have plenty of grain during the 7 famine years, that was in one place. He's storing everything. So if he's handing out grain to his family, at the same time that Egyptians are coming to him begging for their lives, putting those two together really taps into a natural sense of injustice. How is Pharaoh not feeding us first? How is Joseph, his viceroy, not feeding us first? How is anybody getting food if we're not getting food? So again, we have another layer to the potential animosity that seems to be reasonably in place at the end of Genesis. Donna, you had a comment.
I'm just getting back to Bill's really excellent point. I'm so thankful for reading this first part of this story, because in a sense, it lays down the history of anti-Semitism. I mean, I hate to say it, but the whole caste system and how it played out then has been repeated over and over again, in the sense that there's this real power, and then the Jews, through need, aligning themselves or getting into that second rung, and then the resentment coming up, which can never be focused on the real power, and the Jews end up being the scapegoat. And I never realized that it went back this far and was part of this story.
It's a very important perspective to allow yourself to take in the presentation of this story. I'm not sure that we're going to say all this during our Passover Seders, but For our knowledge, it's important. And then the question becomes, how do you break that cycle? There will be a point at which we will have some authority. Someone will have authority over us. How do you break the cycle of retribution? And that actually is built into this story also, although I'm not sure that Dina is going to get to it, but I'll mention it. And it's aligned with something that I learned when I read Pablo Freire. I don't know if you're familiar with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but his literacy training with citizens in Brazil was to help them learn how to articulate their need to their oppressors, how to begin to carve out a place of independence for themselves without becoming oppressors themselves. So should they get power, will they then turn that anger and rage upon the people who oppress them? That's the cycle we want to break. And we read in Torah all the time, and in these passages also, you shall treat the stranger as yourself, the orphan, the widow, the stranger. They shall not live by a different rule. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is how we break the cycle. That even though we know there is a history of oppression where we have been victims of it, and even though we have to accept that every person is capable of the same kind of atrocity that's perpetrated on any person, we have to stop ourselves and we have to think it through differently. And Torah guides us in that thinking. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. Never forget that you too know the burden of oppression. Do not do to others that. Okay. We have a few minutes left. I want to just see if there's another question that Dina's got, because then I want to show you something that I think is pretty cool. With the context of the Egyptians, this is number 2, being slaves to Pharaoh, how do you understand the enslavement of the Hebrews? Is it more justified? Is it more understandable? We're moving in, the question begs the answer, yes, it is now more understandable. In Genesis 41:33, when Joseph is first advising Pharaoh, he tells Pharaoh to appoint a wise and insightful man. And Pharaoh appoints Joseph himself, because there is no one who would be a more insightful and wise advisor. In light of this, why do the Egyptians want to outsmart the Hebrews? What are they looking for? What are they afraid of? So that returns us to our most recent passage where let's outsmart the Hebrews. And Dina is linking that to Pharaoh's choice upon Joseph's request to find someone who's very wise. Find your wisest and most insightful leader who will get us out of this fix, who will manage to help you survive 7 years of upcoming famine. Do you accept the link that she's drawing? Do you see it differently? Marilyn?
I'm almost thinking of the Purim story with Haman and Mordecai, and the divisiveness of appointing people when you think you're going to be the guy who's in power, and it doesn't happen that way. But human nature to think you're the worthy one, and trying to get your position forward like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that in the story of Esther, the end of the story of Esther is a bloodbath. And a lot of times we don't go to the end of the story, or we rush through it very quickly because we're ready for some hamantaschen. But I think that that's a very instructive element of that story. Joel, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I don't mean to throw a live grenade into this, but I've been thinking about the Palestinian situation. Who are the oppressed? Who are the oppressors? What historic decisions of leaders have caused people to perceive the other as horrific enemies who must be vanquished and oppressed? And the Israeli-Palestinian story, you can see from both perspectives. I'm not a great Palestinian lover, but given these issues, you can see that from both perspectives.
Have you, Joel, or anyone seen the series Our Sons, Benenu?
No.
This is really worth watching. It's a few years old, but it basically was a series directed by a Palestinian director and an Israeli director. And it concerns the historical event, relative recent historical event, in which two Israeli hikers were murdered. And then the retribution by Jews upon Arabs was devastating, horrific. And how do you begin to peel that back to understand what's really going on? The Palestinian Arabs speak in Arabic, the Israeli Jews speak in Hebrew. Both of the lead people on each side are bilingual, fluently bilingual. At a certain point, you can't tell. You honestly can't tell who's who. It's really well done. Okay. Yeah, Marilyn.
I'm also reminded of a course I took way back then when we had the College of Jewish Studies, where we were looking at that same situation from both sides. There was a historian, Walter Khalidi, and I forget who the other one was. And we put ourselves in that role. We actually wound up taking a very small course and turning it into a much bigger one, but taking the perspective of promises made on both sides by the British to the same people. And if you suspended disbelief, you could fully understand why there was anger on both sides. And I never imagined that I could see it so clearly, but that was, like Joel was saying, a very similar situation.
The tragic reality is so deep and profound. It's really hard to know what to do with it. I'm going to shift, Judy, and then I'm going to shift gears in a minute.
Just a quick observation. There's an interesting continuum of violence of human against human. That what Joseph does in sort of manipulating things is in some ways like a microaggression. It's like committing some level of low-level violence on others, depriving them of dignity, of food, like sort of playing this game. The retribution of that is even worse. That you read about, and they were brutal, they were ruthless. And that's where we really feel the violence. Like, it's visceral, and yet we kind of like those little undercover violent pieces. We don't kind of pick up on them quite the same way. So when you talk about this cycle of retribution, it only escalates. It seems to only sort of when you're powerless, you consume yourself with the power in a very negative way, in a violent way. So just an observation.
Judy, I actually find it fascinating that passage is added to the story, that the Hebrews were doing just fine. It raises a lot of nasty questions. It puts Joseph in a different light. And what? Pharaoh's coffers are so depleted that he needs the resources of every Egyptian in the land in order to survive it. He's fine. They can't wait it out. They said it would be 7 years. Feed them. Feed them. Get through the 7 years. I want to show you something that I found. Let's see if I can do it. Oops. Come on. Let's get you down there. There we go. Okay. I want to get rid of that. And I want to go to this. Okay. So this is a stela in Egypt called the famine stela.
Is it just me or has the screen not changed for anyone?
Can you see this?
I only see the questions from Dina Weiss for the last
Okay,
one we covered.
thanks for saying that. Let me try that again. Did that work?
Yes.
Do you see it now? Okay. So what I'm going to describe to you is an engraving that includes both 4 individuals on top, 3 gods, 3 deities approaching the pharaoh, okay, and then a lot of Egyptian hieroglyphics below. There's also a crack in the middle, so this is old and it's a bit worn and it has cracked, but I want to tell you what this is. So I'm going to read this to you. The story told on the stela is set in the 18th year of the reign of Zoser. The text described how the king is upset and worried as the land has been in the grip of a drought and famine for 7 years, during which time the Nile has not flooded the farmlands. The text also describes how the Egyptians have suffered as a result of the drought and that they are desperate and breaking the laws of the land. Zoser asks the priest's staff under the supervision of the high lector priest, Imhotep, for help. The king wants to know where the god of the Nile, Hapi, is born and which guide is residing in his place. Hang on a second. Okay. So on my screen, on the far left side is the king. The first god, the first deity approaching the king is Imhotep. No, let me get his name. I'm sorry, let me get his name. Is the god of the Nile. I'm going to spell his name. It's Khnum, Khnum. That's the first god. And he approaches to find out what he should do to relieve the famine, the 7-year famine. He's often portrayed as having a human body and a ram's head. And he is also known as the potter, which is to say the creator, because he fashions people on his potting wheel. So here's what he does. He approaches Hapi to find out what's going on with this god, Khnum. And he falls asleep and has a dream. Before he has a dream, this is what Zoser says to him. I was in mourning on my throne. Those of the palace were in grief. My heart was in great affliction because Hapi had failed to come in time in a period of 7 years. Grain was scant, kernels dried up, scarce was every kind of food. Every man robbed his twin. Those who entered never left. Children cried, youngsters fell. The hearts of the old were grieving. Legs drawn up, they hugged the ground, their arms clasped about them. Courtiers were needy. Temples were shut, shrines covered with dust. Everyone was in distress. This, to me, links back to Rabbi Shapiro's interpretation of the oppression from last week. And this is the Egyptian saying this. Then I want to read to you a bit from Imhotep's dream. As I slept in peace, I found the God standing before me, propitiated him by adoring him and praying to him. He revealed himself to me with kindly face. So the God Khnum is going to present himself in a dream to Imhotep. I am Kum, your maker. My arms are around you to steady your body, to safeguard your limbs. I bestow on you stones upon stones that were not found before, of which no work was made, for building temples, for rebuilding ruins, inlaying statues' eyes. For I am the master who makes. I am he who made himself, exalted Nun, who came forth, happy who hurries at will, fashioner of every body. I guide each man in his hour. I Tartan, the father of gods, great Shu high in heaven. The shrine I dwell in has 2 lips. And when I open up the well, I know Hape hugs the field, a hug that fills each nose with life. For when hugged, the field is reborn. I shall make Hape gush for you. No year of lack and want anywhere. Plants will grow, weighted down by their fruit. With Rinutat ordering all things are supplied in millions. I shall let your people fill up. They shall grasp together with you. Gone will be the hunger years, ended the dearth of their bins. Egypt's people will come striding. Shores will shine in the excellent flood. Hearts will be happier than ever before. That's what's engraved. That's part of what's engraved on this stele. And I think it's just fascinating that Zoser, who reigned 2300, 2400 BCE, talks about that's the myth there is, or the history there is, a 7-year drought. And what happens to the Egyptian people because of the drought, and what their God presents to Imhotep, the Pharaoh's agent, in a dream, that they will be redeemed. So the point of this, and I think together we've pretty much made that point on Dina Weiss's behalf, but the point is that if you open your mind to it and take a broader look at the players in the drama, you can begin to understand from multiple perspectives the different players in this drama and begin to see their points of view with greater sympathy. And that's the point of her presenting this lesson in this way. Final comments or questions? Yeah, Judy.
Back to, this sort of interesting, harkening back to the big origins of anti-Semitism, it's a little uncomfortable to have this sort of notion that, not that we brought it on ourselves, but that behavior of our ancestor had a role to play in what followed after it. And it's uncomfortable. That's not in the Haggadah. That's not what we do on Pesach. But like, how do we? It's the question. What do we do with power? Like, who does power serve? Who does it serve to not have power? It's a very dicey question.
I absolutely agree. And the more you peel it back, the more, what's it called when a road takes a swerve and takes a swerve? It swerves and swerves and so switchback. The more switchbacks you experience. Anita, last comment.
Yeah, I agree, but I think we were meant to be a light unto the nation. So my take on anti-Semitism is a little bit different. I just think we were put on earth to make the world a better place. The struggle that we cause in people of good feeling, I think that's my take on anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's very consistent with Torah teaching. Because of what I said earlier, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know what this is. Do not do this to others. Right? Okay. So now I have to make an enormous apology. It's 4 minutes after 10, and I was thinking our session lasted till 10. but it doesn't, right? It lasts till 10:15. Well, unless you have something very pressing to add or something enjoyable to add, whatever it is. Yeah, Nancy.
Just a little bit of oppositional defiance.
Oh, please.
A lot of this, which we are commanded to do as a way of thinking about our belief system, is all fine and good for us, and it's fairly intellectual. But the practicality of it, there's a disconnect, because those who hate us, for whatever reason or no reason, are not going through the same exercise. So are we not wailing in the wind? Or are we being a light to the nations when the nations really want to live in darkness from our perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very tiring to always be the other, and to have these conversations at Seder table about what happened to what befell us and how we persist and how hope is there when those who hate us are not engaged in that same conversation. And notwithstanding what David Brooks or whoever said, we all have to have civil conversations. That only happens if both sides or multiple sides are civil or undergo some kind of same intellectual exercise and get down to the practical. What does it mean? So that's just a little bit of defiance on my part, that it's very tiring. And our history is very tiring, notwithstanding all the hope we have and a belief system, which I think is very positive. It's for the very few of us that exist in the world, the weight of that fewness is oppressive. So
I'm going to lift your comments up. I really appreciate them. And I think that it's all well and good if both parties to a dispute are willing to think and take a look at the other party's position. And how rare is that? Very rare. Much more common, and in fact, rather daunting, is the reality that one side has no interest at all in accommodating the other. And I think that to a certain extent, I think that's human nature. For Judaism, which is such a practical religion, which offers us steps and suggestions and processes to go through in order to hone the better qualities in ourselves. If the other side is living in a different world, from a different point of view, with a different set of grievances, and targets us for whatever reason, I mean, at a certain point, you fight back. You fight back because it becomes an existential threat. If you can keep it from becoming an existential threat, good. But if you cannot, you fight. And Judaism is not a Gandhiist religion. It does not say, under no circumstances do you pick up, a weapon. So, yeah, Nancy, I'm in agreement. Wendy, what would you say?
I agree with all of that it's really frustrating to feel like you don't have anybody to have that conversation with. But don't we still have a responsibility to have a conversation among ourselves about what do we do when we do have power? I mean, I'm thinking about Israel. Mm-hmm. And about, even if we feel like we don't have a partner on the other side to talk with, mm-hmm. don't we still have a responsibility to think about how we use or abuse our power? And yes, we have been oppressed, but don't we have a responsibility to not oppress anyway? It's all very complicated and difficult, but I don't know. I feel like we still need to be thinking about that, even if we're tired of, which we are, of being targeted.
I mean, there's comments in the chat, and I noticed nods of heads as both of you are speaking, Nancy and Wendy. Anita, did you? Yeah.
I agree that we Jews don't know how to deal with power, but look, we've only had power for 75 years since the inception of the state of Israel. That's what brought us Jewish power. We were powerless before that. Just a point. And I keep thinking about the starfish story. Matters to the one starfish.
Yes. Donna. And then Eileen, did you have a question?
No, I would like to applaud what Wendy said. I think that we have had, in response to Nita, we've had power in other places, and I've watched it be gentle and beautiful, and I've watched it be very offensive and destructive. I see it in my own community, Jews against Jews and Jews against Chinese. And we don't know how. There are dictums within our lineage that tells us to destroy the other tribe as well. We have to choose not to use those dictums. We have to choose to rise above and find the better self in ourselves and as an exemplar. And yes, sometimes you'll suffer that way, but you'll also hopefully teach a lesson. And that's what we have to rise to.
Absolutely. There's a through line, because we mentioned Esther earlier. There's a through line that the whole reason we had the difficulty we had in Persia is traceable through Haman to the Amalekites. That Saul did not kill all the Amalekites, but let the king go stay alive. And as a result, now we have this lineage coming forward to present an existential threat to us. So we have in our history both sides of this coin. Donna.
So taking it out of Israel and to the United States for a little bit, and the rise of anti-Semitism and the continual threat of anti-Semitism, to me, this speaks to, and it won't surprise anybody on this call to hear me say this, that the need for, we are a tiny minority and we have this history. To me, it speaks to the need for organizing with other oppressed groups and being in line with them in order to be able to do anything around the real powers that be. And not seeing ourselves necessarily as the only oppressed group, and seeing ourselves in line with other people who are oppressed, and not just times, by the way, when we are actively under threat, other times too, and that we are always vulnerable in that space. And we always need to be thinking through that, and especially now.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. Good. Any other comments? Okay. Well, in that case, I really want to thank everybody and hope that you have a warm and healthy week, and I will see you next Wednesday. Elizabeth, can you stay on for a second and just walk me through what I do here? Okay, great. Thank you. Have a good week, everyone.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as long as you hit record, you shouldn't have to worry about anything else. I can't hear you. Why can't I hear you? Did you took your microphone away?
Can you hear me now? Okay. So my question, what happened last week is that I had hit record, obviously, and then afterwards, where did it go?
Okay, well, from here on out, I'll deal with it because you can't email it. It's too big. You have to put it online. So I put it on our YouTube page and then send the link out.
Okay, so if anybody asks me, I say, go to Fairmont Temple's page.
Mm,
No.
no, get their email and send their email to me and I will make sure they get the link. How about that? That's, yeah, that's
Thank
the way.
you.
I can send it. Do you have a list of the people who
No.
participate? Okay, then yeah, I'm on it. Don't worry.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. I
You're
feel like
welcome.
you're my four-pointed cane that I'm walking with.
Is it okay?
Are you kidding?
Okay. Well, some people hate canes. I don't know.
No, I'll take
You
all the
like the
help.
assistance. Okay.
I'll take all the
Awesome.
help I can get. You're doing
Good.
well?
Yes. Very
Okay,
much.
one more question before we stop. So I want to come in at some point and just have you walk me through what's going on Sunday
Okay.
so that I have a refresher. Should I come in tomorrow? Should I come in Friday? When do you leave? What
Like
would
when
be, what would be good for you?
I'm here Thursday and Friday, but only till noon.
Okay, okay,
So if you can come in before noon on either of those days, I don't have anything scheduled.
perfect. It'll probably be Friday, but it'll
Okay.
definitely be before noon.
Okay. Cool. I'll
Thank
see
you,
you.
Elizabeth.
Thank
Okay, good.
you.
Bye.
Bye.